Thank you very much, Olivier, for having me here, and thank you to the Center for War Study. It's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to present my research here. So this is one of the first times I actually present my book while the book has actually been completed. So whatever you're going to tell me, I'll certainly take it into account, but I won't be able to actually change the manuscript. And I'm not sure it gives me a sense of relief or worry. So I'll do my best to give you a little bit of a sense of what I found interesting, the kind of question I asked, and give you some insight and a snapshot of my empirics. So I really started this project with a very maybe naive observation, which was that in peacekeeping operations, there are a lot of state militaries involved. Peacekeepers are mostly militaries. And yet there was a complete lack of studies on the military side of peacekeeping. So I just started reflecting a little bit on state military organizations that are really like a special kind of bureaucracy. Goffman, a very famous sociologist, referred to some kinds of monasteries and mental institutions and military as total institutions. There are institutions where the ties among the members are so strong that sometimes the individual identity actually gets stripped away, or at least partly gets stripped away, so that members become socialized to this general culture, this more general collectivistic kind of identity. Also, state military organizations have a pretty special role in contemporary states, which is that they have the monopoly of a state's legitimate use of violence, which also makes them like a really special kind of bureaucracy with a very special function. There is also a very widely held assumption, both in the academic discussion, but also in the policy world, both in military sociology and in security studies and political science at large, that the military should simply and automatically implement what the civilian principals, the civilian decision makers would tell them to do. And also, we are still stuck pretty much with that traditional image of state militaries and soldiers as warriors. And there is also very widely held assumption that the core tasks of contemporary state military organizations is still combat, and there is this self-perception of soldiers as warriors themselves. But then there are these peace and stability operations, right, where soldiers sometimes have to fight and sometimes have to deliver humanitarian aid and sometimes have to build bridges, and they have to do all sorts of interesting stuff that are not necessarily combat-related stuff. And peacekeeping operations in particular, and I would say low-intensity kinds of interventions such as COIN more at large, would really requires ask of soldiers to do other things than combat. So sometimes delivering humanitarian aid and interacting with local authorities and choosing where to, for instance, launch a particular CIMIC, civil military coordination project, is really important. And this also is strikingly different from what we have seen in the peace operations literature that has flourished over the past 20, 25 years. In the peacekeeping literature, which is dominantly quantitative, there is a very strong focus on mission-level dynamics. So you would know, for instance, if you read the fantastic, excellent work done by Lisa Hultman and co-authors and Paige Fordna, that what really matters is the mission level, the mission mandate, for instance, and whether a mission has been effective or not at protecting civilians or ending atrocities. And these are extremely important questions, but they don't take into account at all the how. How does that work in practice? The other really interesting thing about the peacekeeping literature is that they have, partly for data limitation and partly for epistemological reason, they've really overemphasized the size and number of peacekeepers deployed to try to explain, for instance, Hultman shows that the more troops you deploy in a peace mission, the more you're going to have lower levels of violence against civilians, for instance. So there is really definitely an overemphasis on material resources and mandate, a number of peacekeepers deployed. And then the third very strong assumption that the peacekeeping literature makes is that whatever the mandate, depending on the mandate that you have in a peacekeeping mission, that is going to result into a certain kind of behavior at the mission level. And this is somewhat, I try to suggest that this is somewhat problematic, because if we think that there are all these peacekeepers involved, how can we really assume that whatever the mandate, if there is going to be like a traditional peacekeeping mandate versus a more peace enforcement mandate, then how can we know that this will be necessarily translated in exactly the same way? And there is a little bit of interesting and growing literature in military sociology and security studies also that suggests that different militaries have different operational styles in peace operations. But I'm sure that you're also familiar with other instances and other anecdotes of how different state military organizations may actually behave differently when they come under fire or when they are deployed in an operation. So let me just give you two examples here. I'm sorry, I didn't see that this was not very looking very. This is not looking very elegant at all. Voila, better. Okay, sorry. So one example comes from something that was going on around 2010 in the Regional Command South during the NATO operation in Afghanistan. So we are in the Regional Command South, and the US forces had decided to withdraw from a specific area of operation and to hand it over to Polish soldiers. And then Time magazine reported that Americans had to return to take charge, he said, because the Poles are just kind of hanging around. This is just an anecdote which suggests that potentially Polish soldiers had a different way of implementing the mandate, exactly the same mandate, in an area that had been under US control. So suggesting that, again, Polish and American soldiers might have a different approach to the NATO mission in Afghanistan, particularly in the Regional Command South. Another quite interesting example comes from the Regional Command capital, very close to Kabul. We're still in the NATO mission in Afghanistan. This is on the top you have an Italian soldier doing foot patrol, and at the bottom a French soldier. Something that happened in 2008 was that a particularly complex and with high insurgent activity area, the Surobi Valley, was handed over from Italian control to French control. In an area that was very, very close to Kabul, which was allegedly a quite pacified, relatively calm area. But the Surobi Valley was particularly problematic and tactically and strategically very important. And when the French arrived and took over that area, it was May 2008. In early June they were ambushed, and that was actually one of the worst attack against French forces during the NATO mission in Afghanistan. So, and then there was a whole debate around that. And the Time magazine, afterwards reported by the New York Times as well, said that Italy's forces paid off the Taliban in 2008 to maintain calm in an area of Afghanistan under Italian control. And then subsequently, because the French took over and they had allegedly a different approach, then they were attacked as a sort of warning. So whatever the issue of bribing the Taliban means, and it's very hard to empirically ascertain what was going on. What seems to be pretty clear here is that there seems to be a troop contributing country that has a much stricter interpretation of the mandate, which clearly emphasizes kinetic activities, the French, while the Italians seem to have a little bit more of or willing to close an eye in respect to insurgent activities in its area. So this is what seems to have emerged pretty clearly from those events and this particular vignette. So it's quite interesting to think about this in more general terms. So in peacekeeping operations, we have all these soldiers deployed, assigned to a specific area of operation. And why do, in this particular case, in the regional command capital, why in similar circumstances certain troop contributing countries emphasize humanitarian aspects of the mandate while others emphasize combat? So this is a bit of a puzzle that I've been struggling with, and which becomes really my research question at the core of this book. Where I ask, why do some armies emphasize their military posture while others emphasize the humanitarian posture while deployed in peace and stability operations under similar constraints. And I'll tell you more about the under similar constraints bit in a second. But let me first tell you a little bit more about how I'll try to convince you that culture really matters. So first, I'll spell out my argument and my contribution. Then I'll move on to methods and empirics, and particularly my strategy of data collection. Then I'll move on to the empirics to try to show you how these how the argument played out in practice, and I'll draw some conclusions, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the kind of research I'm doing right now as a follow-up to that. So the core argument that I make is that military cultures influence the way in which different armies behave in operations. So basically, talking with the language of variables, then the independent variable would be military culture, and the dependent variable would be force employment. But just so you know, the argument of the book is actually a little bit broader than this. So in the book, I also tried to understand how culture looks the way it does, because I struggled for years with the fact that culture was looking a little bit too thin and it was not really convincing. So then I started this whole exploration on the source of culture. And then I also looked into what kind of effect do these variations in behavior have for peacekeeping effectiveness. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this, but I would be happy to answer questions more broadly about any broader question you might have relating to this. So in terms of force employment, which is the dependent variable, I try to use Biddle's work based on the book Military Power, and Biddle's definition of force employment, which is that force employment is the way in which material resources and number of troops interact to result in observable behavior in the field. But of course, studying peacekeeping operations, I needed to adapt this concept a little bit to the specifics of a different kind of operation, which is done by the military, but really doesn't really have victory as an objective, but has more the implementation of the mandate as an objective. So I've expanded force employment to cover most soldiers' activities in peace operations. And I sort of tried to develop a set of measures for force employment, a set of observables that I could trace in all my different cases. So the first one has to do with patrolling, and so number of patrols, timing of patrols, and level of armaments displayed during patrol. The second one has to do with the interaction with military forces, with local military forces. How often do they do, for instance, certain peacekeepers stop by a Lebanese armed force doing patrol? And then the third dimension has to do with the interaction with civilian, how likely it is that they launch CMIC civil-military cooperation projects. And the fourth one has to do with force protection, so how well the force is protected, both while out on patrolling, but also in the base and while entering the base. So my independent variable is military culture. And this is really the core of the theory in the book. So there is a quite wide debate on military culture, but this debate got a little stuck in the early 2000s, and we haven't really had that many studies really sort of theorizing about military culture since. So I define military culture based on what is called the third generation scholars on culture, where I argue that culture is actually distinct from behavior. And I argue that culture is this core set of beliefs, attitudes, and values that is shared by members of a national army and guides its perception and decisions about strategy, operation, and tactics. I think you could also vividly think about military culture as a pair of goggles that you can wear and that can make you understand and interpret the world in particular ways. And so you can think about culture also, like when thinking about examples, for instance, you could think of the Israeli Defense Forces military culture, which is, for instance, very much emphasizing individual initiative and, pretty low and relatively relaxed hierarchy structures, as opposed to, for instance, the Japanese traditional military culture, which is much more collectivistic, just to give you some ideas of how the dimension along which it can vary. I've been, because of my focus on peace operation, I've become particularly interested in on the propensity of a particular military culture to adapt to new conventional tasks that are not conventional combat tasks. So how much on a spectrum a military culture would be more oriented to humanitarian tasks or non-conventional tasks at large, as opposed to more combat and traditional tasks. So this is like a dreadful slide that I should definitely cut down a little, but it's a very ambitious attempt to basically compress the theory of my entire book in a slide. But if you allow me, I'll guide you through it, and I think it could actually be interesting. So if we start from military culture, and I've said that my theory has to do with how culture influences force employment and military behavior at the tactical operational level. So this is really the core and I think the most interesting part of the book. But to really understand what culture is, we need to sort of take a step back, because military culture deploys with peacekeepers, but it's pre-existing the peacekeeping mission itself. So military culture is really made up of these really long ingrained beliefs, but it's also partly reactive to specific domestic conditions. And this is something I think that differs from between my own conceptualization of military culture from the one done by other researchers that have written about culture. So I try to sort of look at how culture reacts, and I particularly argue that after a critical juncture, using historical institutionalism, the pre-existing civil-military relations equilibrium and the societal beliefs about the use of force get modified. And that particular critical juncture, this particular shock, creates a window of opportunity for culture to change and adapt as well. So then the culture that I'm observing, and I was observing in a peacekeeping mission, is this very long ingrained culture that has emerged after a particular critical juncture, has basically changed it from the one that was existing in a country before then. So after that, there is this new modified version of military culture that emerges from these specific domestic conditions. And it's really about the role of military organization, and it acquires a life of its own, but it cannot be any kind of culture. So it would be very unlikely to have, say, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, individualistic culture in a country like Japan. So the military culture needs to be functional and embedded into domestic political configuration. I think this is the main takeaway, really. And then after that critical juncture, there is a new kind of more functional kind of culture that emerges that becomes really persistent and inertial. When soldiers deploy, their service military culture deploys with them, and such culture affects the way in which the unit perceives the mission. So how they just see the mission. Is it a war for them, or is it more like a peacekeeping mission? And also how they identify the enemy. And then as a consequence, this affects the way in which these peacekeepers behave, how much they patrol, and within the margins of maneuvers that are allowed, taking into account caveats and mandates and all these very many other things, and indirectly unit peace operation effectiveness. So I'm expecting, for instance, to observe that those peacekeeping units that, for instance, do less patrols, that should have an effect on the sort of security situation in their respective area of operation, taking into account, of course, movement of rebel activities and a number of other very complicated things. But this is the theory. This is how it should work empirically. So, of course, as you might suspect, this very quite narrow tactical level focused theory has struggled quite a lot over the years with a number of competing explanations. So I'll just engage a little bit with that and tell you a little bit more about how I dealt with this. So first of all, I've tried to control basically for as many confounders as possible, really for the design. So I've tried to sort of make sure that the units, the peacekeeping units that I was selecting had sort of similar, had gone through similar kinds of training, so that training wouldn't be an obvious confounder that could affect the behavior of these soldiers. Then I've also tried to select the material resources, so that I tried to select soldiers that were deploying more or less the similar amount of troops and similar kinds of vehicles and similar kinds of level of armaments also in general. And then I've also tried to select units that were deployed under similar threat level. So of course, it would not have made much sense, for instance, to compare Danish soldiers deployed in Afghanistan with Swedish soldiers deployed in Afghanistan, because they were deployed in completely different areas. So that would not have made any sense. So I've tried to sort of select peacekeeping troops that were deployed in areas of comparable levels of difficulty. And then, of course, there was this big issue that, of course, state military organizations are quite strongly influenced by military doctrine that really shapes also partly their military culture. And so that's definitely something quite important to take into account. But I tried to select two peacekeeping troops that are relatively similar in terms of doctrine. And then I sort of looked into a number of mission-specific characteristics. So I tried to look for units that were deployed under identical mandates, and also that were somehow deploying under relatively similar standard operating procedures. For instance, by them, and that was an extremely tricky issue because being someone that doesn't have a clearance, a security clearance, I had to struggle quite a bit to try to get at what were really these standard operating procedures and how could they have affected that. And I mean, I don't deny that standard operating procedures are really very important for the functioning of peacekeeping forces and other kinds of forces at the tactical level. But I think and we can talk more about this, but I think I found ways to sort of make sure that they were not at least affecting the particular behavioral variations that I was observing. And then so I was left with like my own military culturalist explanation, and then three other pretty important competing explanations that I tried to do competitive theory testing with. So I tried to collect empirical material to try to disentangle what was mostly predominating here. The whole idea of the research design for answering this question with this kind of argument was really that I thought that peace operations were really interesting because unlike other kinds of military operations, say particularly COIN, but also more conventional kinds of military operations, they allow for wider margins of maneuver. So I thought it would be maybe an easy test because soldiers are left, particularly in UN peacekeeping and also to some extent in other regional organizations peacekeeping, they are left a little bit freer at the tactical operational level to fill in some of the blanks that are left out, that are left blank after caveats and mandate have been taken into account. And then I've also tried to sort of look for two operations. Of course, I was, because of the kind of study, I had to study ongoing peace operations. But then I tried to sort of maximize the external validity of this. So to maximize sort of the ability of this theory to travel across very different types of peace operations. So I looked for a hard case for my theory, which would be the NATO mission in Afghanistan, which is looking a lot more kinetic than it is the UN mission in Lebanon. And so it's a hard case because the NATO standardizing effort is much stronger. And the easy case then was the UN mission in Lebanon. And then within each of these two missions, the UN mission in Lebanon and the NATO mission in Afghanistan, I sort of picked two cases that displayed similar characteristics so that I could see if there was something about culture that could explain these variations that I observed in behavior. So these are my cases. I focus on the French 1st Fusilier Battalion from Epinal deployed under the UN mission in Lebanon, and the Italian Ariete Brigade deployed in the UN mission in Lebanon. And then I focus on one French and one Italian unit in Afghanistan. So you might think, and that would be a very valid thinking, like can you really compare these units? Isn't there something at the unit level that might account for some of these variations? My theory is really plays at the service level. So I argue that there is a common army military culture, a French and an Italian army culture that can account for some of these variations. I observed some unit-specific variations, but I think they were more really specific and they were much less recurring than the quite systematic variations in behavior that I found at the service level. So within each of these cases, so within Lebanon and within Afghanistan, I went for a more similar system design. So in Lebanon, these two French units were deployed under identical command, identical mandate, similar level of difficulty, and same amount of troops and weapons, but still they displayed quite important variations in behavior. And then I compared that, with the variations in military culture. And I'll tell you more when we get to the empirics about this. So how did I collect all this material for this study? So I really combined a number of strategies of data collection. The first and main one was probably the in-depth qualitative interviews. So I did a lot of interviews, both to trace military culture and forced employment. So the core of the material has been made by interviewing personnel, active duty personnel deployed in the UN mission in Lebanon and the NATO mission in Afghanistan, those that were going out and about doing patrolling and doing CIMICs. And for months I collected this material to try to trace first and document these variations in behavior and how they interpreted the mandate. And then once back, I tried to sort of try to understand if there was any parallel with the variations in military culture that I was finding. And then I combined this with semi-structured questionnaires that helped a lot to sort of get a sense of the culture, of the core tenets of military culture, and participant observation, particularly about forced employment. So I went out with French and Italian units in both Lebanon and Afghanistan to try to observe how they did patrolling, how they behaved towards the local. And then this is, of course, complemented with quite bulky analysis of documents and historical sources to back up sort of what I was finding about basically the most ingrained and most inertial elements of military culture. And I've done this between 2007 and 2014. So let me now show you a little bit more give you a snapshot of the empirics. So I'll start by basically outlining how the French and the Italian military cultures look like in my study, and then I try to trace it, try to show you how it affected the way in which when deployed, how these French and Italian units actually behaved when deployed in peacekeeping. And I'll focus only on Lebanon for time reasons, but I would be more than happy to answer questions about Afghanistan as well. So how does the French military culture look like? So I argue that the core characteristics of the French army military culture is based on something I called contained assertiveness. So, and I argue that this is the result of a convergence between a very long and quite deeply ingrained belief that is the idea of assertiveness, of the French army being assertive, and which then became tempered in the early 60s with this other very strong belief about having to keep quiet and having to be very, very contained and silent in relation to particularly the principal, the decision makers. Let me tell you how this came about. So assertiveness seems to be quite consistent. I traced it back actually from the mid-19th century and mainly on secondary sources. But this assertiveness persisted in the French army culture also after World War II. So there were these, of course, these very heroic deeds of, liberation and of resistance and liberation from the Vichy regime and the Nazi occupation. And so this was really interpreted as a sign of the army assertiveness. So there are a number of really interesting diaries and memoirs where the officers in particular reflect on how, notwithstanding against all odds, the French army had managed to maintain its assertiveness. And this is something that remained quite strongly, also that I found quite strongly also in the NATO mission in Afghanistan and Lebanon when talking and interviewing French soldiers and officers. I should also have said earlier that I collected material across ranks. So although the officers are overrepresented, I've also interviewed, through a method of stratified where I stratified the selection of my interviewees. I also interviewed non-commissioned officers and enlisted. But for instance, to go back to the assertiveness idea, the French army culture was very well exemplified by this NCO that I interviewed in Afghanistan, who told me, we are going to go for it. He felt very frustrated because he was part of this 8th RPIME, this Marine Parachute Infantry Battalion, and his sister battalion was actually involved in heavy fighting in the Regional Command East, and these guys from the Regional Command capital were stuck in the bases. And so the frustration was very strong, and I was getting a lot of this. We're going to go for it. And it's all about the perpetuation of this idea of the French fury. And then an NCS in Lebanon told me, if you do peacekeeping, then you miss a point as a soldier. This was a very, very, very recurrent theme also in the French, among French peacekeepers deployed in Lebanon, where peacekeeping is just something you do in your free time, but what French soldiers are really doing is combat. And then a general that I interviewed in Paris a bit more recently said, tried to convey it like this: whatever happens, they are going to manage, thanks to the débrouillardise à la française, so this French resourcefulness. So this idea of assertiveness seems to be pretty strong, but it became quite contained after a critical juncture that happened in the early 1960s. So the army, the French army, particularly the French officer corps, became pretty, let's say, lost its sense of mission and discipline already in the early 1950s. And that was particularly related to the experience, the colonial campaigns in Indochina and Algeria, where we find that really the French officer corps progressively lost its sense of mission and discipline. And so there were several attempts of insubordination, which culminated in a very famous putsch attempt in Algiers in April 1961. And particularly interesting for us and for this theory is the forceful reaction that de Gaulle imposed to that putsch attempt. In a very famous televised message, he said he reaffirmed the norm of civilian and the whole idea of civilian control over the military. And that's something that, if you were with me when interviewing these soldiers in Afghanistan and Lebanon, that came across very strongly. So there was this assertiveness, but it was also very contained by this idea that, at some point during the French Army officer corps, particularly history, there was a moment of disbandment, and there was a serious attempt to challenge civilian control. And so that reaction and the sense of having to keep quiet and the sense of obedience and showing and obedience is something that is very strongly felt, and that also I think affects, I would argue, civil-military relations in France at large, and the ability of of the officer corps to speak up when they disagree on something. They usually use retired generals for that purpose, to speak up against certain decisions. So that's a quite interesting twist that the French military culture took. So, and this is something. These are some interview quotes from my interviews. So we are French soldiers. This French officer told me, it is particular. We are not allowed to be loud in our criticism. And then an NCO said, we are allowed to fight, we are soldiers, that is what we do, but we have to be moderate, have restraint, because the politicians are watching us. So this very strong sense that the politicians are watching us is something that I didn't find in the Italian case at all, nor in other, explicit reflection on that seems to be completely absent in other peacekeeping armies. The Italian military culture is somewhat different. It's very different, actually. And it's the core characteristics of the Italian military. It's really about being good humanitarian soldiers. And this comes from a fusion between a long-ingrained idea of Italian soldiers as good people and the need to reacquire a lost legitimacy. So the Italian soldiers' idea as good people is something quite strange that emerged already, that I found already emerging in the mid-19th century, but then becomes particularly strong when reading historical accounts of colonial campaigns and during World War II, where Italian soldiers would do and commit exactly the same kinds of brutal violations that other armies, but they would just be perceived and as good people, brava gente. So then in this particular case, there is a different critical juncture, which is September 1943, when there is an armistice is signed between the Allies and the new sort of Italian Prime Minister, and Mussolini has fallen in July. And at that point, in September 1943, the Italian armed forces, and particularly the army, is left without orders. So some Some military units joined the resistance, others kept fighting alongside the Nazis, and others joined the Allies. But actually, most of them just started to hide and went home. So this is perceived to be a very strong and unresolved disconnect between the army and its society, the army and its people. And then I argue that during the Cold War, the army tried very hard to reacquire a lost legitimacy. And in the 1980s and 1990s, they get a chance to actually achieve new legitimacy. So Nancy has told me very vividly that peacekeeping is a great opportunity for us to be seen differently, not just as a bunch of fascists. So it would be just a way to sort of, normalize the military. And then there is this other belief of good humanitarian soldiers. So the question now is, how did military culture affect the behavior of French and Italian soldiers deployed in the UN mission in Lebanon? So in the UN mission in Lebanon, I selected the Italian unit deployed here and the French unit deployed there. So they were deployed under exactly the same regional command. And as I already said, there were a number of factors that were ruled out by design. In terms of HQ directives, mandate, it was identical, equipment and vehicles that were very similar, number of troops, very, very similar, threat level, very comparable, and area of operation under the same command. And here, things start to get quite interesting because then, despite all these similarities, the Italian military culture, the Italian peacekeepers deployed seems to really understand the mission as a traditional peacekeeping mission. And that there was no enemy to be fought. There was no enemy anywhere. That was a traditional peacekeeping mission. And by contrast, for French soldiers, the mission is a peace support was labeled as a peace support operation, and the enemy was clearly identified as Hezbollah. And this had a number of consequences for the behavior of these soldiers in operation and how they interpreted the identical mandate they had. So in terms of patrol, the French peacekeepers did on average 27 patrols a day, and the Italians did 15. So they did much fewer patrols. The Italians did much fewer patrols than the French. In terms of timing of patrol, the French mainly did night patrols because, as a captain told me when I interviewed him in Lebanon, because at night all cats are gray, which is a French expression for saying, we can actually detect hostile activities. And in terms of level of armament, the French use heavy and noisy Leclerc tanks, while the Italians only used light armored vehicles, despite also having heavy tanks at their disposal. In terms of interaction with military forces, the French did a lot more several joint activities with the Lebanese armed forces. And the Italians preferred not to interact with the LAF. So in that particular regard, the French were actually much better at implementing one of the provisions of the mandate. And in terms of interaction with civilians, the French did not prioritize CIMIC at all, while civil-military coordination activities, while the Italians carried out several projects. And in terms of force protection, the Italians showed much lower force protection levels than the French. So in sum, overall, while Italian soldiers prioritized interaction with the local population and aid projects, French did much more patrolling and displayed higher force protection measures. And I argue that this is in line with the situational perception of French and Italian contingents deployed and the respective French and Italian military culture. So in conclusion, you must be relieved. So theoretically, the military, I argue that military culture is constituted by different norms and beliefs which interact with each other, and they actually, following certain critical juncture, they may actually adjust to changing domestic conditions. Also, I think that my work shows that military culture provides members of the organization with a toolkit for action for soldiers in the field and shapes soldiers' perception of context, because there are quite a lot of margins of maneuvers that are left out once we take into account mandate and SOPs and caveats. But interestingly, military culture also helps soldiers to navigate within domestic constraints, because I think that the historical part of my work also shows how culture actually adapted quite smartly, quite functionally to new changing domestic conditions. And so it adapts to around specific domestic constraints. And so I think that I think we need to study more how military organizations deployed in operation actually have to take genuine political decisions, and better in general, we need to theorize a lot more about how military cultures and military organizations at large are nested into broader domestic dynamics. And I think there is a lot of really interesting research that could be done there. In terms of policy implications, I think that I do not deny at all that there are the launching a multinational mission as outstanding and is undeniable in terms of benefits, in terms of legitimacy, and in terms of really speaking, for the UN. But they also come with political cost, and I think we need to think a little bit more systematically about what these costs are. And I think number of troops and technology are just but one of the relevant factors that we need to take into account when trying to make peacekeeping more effective. And we are seeing this a lot, like in the current debate on how to reform UN peacekeeping. The emphasis has really been a lot on number of troops and how soldiers should be launching more kinetic operation, how we should increase the amount of troops deployed per area of operation. This is one factor, but there are we need to make sure that peacekeepers know how to do peacekeeping. And so I think that there is also something to be said about how cultural variations might be important for affecting coordination across contingents in a multinational mission, well beyond, I think, the peacekeeping experience, also more in general in working within alliances. I think that could be something quite important. And just to sum up, I'll just tell you a little bit more about what I'm doing right now. So I'm trying to work a little bit more on some of these topics. Particularly, I become really fascinated with how norms and cultures interact, and how much certain new norms or norms that become newly salient are resonant with the culture of an organization. So I'm looking right now into the norm of search and rescue at sea, and how soldiers are socialized into the norm of restraints. And for this, we're doing quite a large-scale surveys across the officer corps in Sweden. And then I'm also studying a little bit more how non-violent military involvement in politics look like, and what it means, and how to conceptualize it. And we have a paper on terrorism and military involvement in politics. And then the third thing I'm doing right now is think a bit more systematically about everything I've been telling you today, and a bit more quantitatively as well. So we are writing currently a book on mission composition and peacekeeping effectiveness, looking both at diversity across blue helmets, but also at the relation between blue helmets and leadership. I think I'll stop here, and I'm much looking forward to your comments.
Thank you.